denominations, right? And I hesitate to even, honestly, on some of them, to even say Christian denominations, but there might be an outward similarity in regards to, don't smoke, don't drink, very family oriented, right? And that can be confusing to some people, but I think it is important to understand, even sometimes when you read some of writings, there may be phrases and things that are similar, right? And so we understand, I just think it's important to understand the distinction. What is the difference? And I don't want to spend a ton of time talking a whole lot about other denominations and what they believe, but I do think, at least at the high level, it is important to understand the distinction. Because so many times people are going to say there's no distinction, or, well, we're so close, we're so similar. And there really is very, very critical differences. Also recently went through a little bit of a study where we talked about we talked about the Reformers, and how so many, it drives me crazy, so many independent Baptists really lift up the Reformers as these great guys, and really talk about how awesome they were, and promote them and things like that. And I wanted to draw out the fact that, listen, the Reformers, they would not have liked us, okay? You look at guys like Martin Luther and John Calvin, a lot of their writings and some of their sermons and stuff, they're recorded for us. We have them today, right? They've been translated into English. You can go read them. I think Tanya found that if you go to Sermon Audio, somebody has narrated, like some of their sermons. You can listen to some of this stuff. But you don't have to study their beliefs very long to realize that, like John Calvin, hey, listen, there may be some things that we have in common, but there's some really, really important differences that we have too, right? And we talked about the fact that when you read what John Calvin and guys like Martin Luther believed about baptism, you learn really quickly that they do not believe salvation the same way that we do. You also read what John Calvin, Martin Luther, and some of those guys wrote about Anabaptists who believed in, only believers being baptized, and that if you were baptized into the Roman Catholic Church and then later were saved, you needed to be rebaptized. Martin Luther and John Calvin, they did not like those people. Persecuted them in some cases. So, I think it's just important to understand. You hear a lot of different things in this world, and I think it's important to understand, just to kind of just do a little bit of a level set and really understand what they taught compared to what we believe, right? Well, this is this study that we started last Sunday on paganism is a little different. It's along those same lines. I hesitate to call it a sermon, but it's been on my mind for quite a while now, and there are several things that triggered that. One, if you have read much about this at all, you will understand that paganism is one of the fastest growing religions in the United States. As they've tracked it and it's became more and more mainstream, it is growing rapidly. Now, it's still a small fraction. You look at the number of, there's different organizations that try to do studies of different religions and how many are there and things like that. And I realize that those things are a little hard to track down. And so you take some of those numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt. But understand that, it's in the ballpark, right? And they kind of, well, how many, there's 23% of the U.S. is Catholic, and, 50% is this denomination, and 36% are unaffiliated. And I think paganism and witchcraft and some of those things are kind of lumped in together. And I think they're now making up about 1% of the population, right? So it's a small number still, but when you look at how fast it has grown, I think it's a little staggering. The other thing that I think is staggering is just how mainstream it is. There was a time where it would not have even been considered, like, it would have just been laughable, right? Oh yeah, you're a witch. Like, haha. But even mainstream media, people in general, right? It is just recognized as another spiritual path. And so I think almost as much as how much it's growing is a concern, is people's attitude toward it being, well, that's just another thing. Like there's many paths to the light, right? And this is your path. It's a little alarming just how acceptable it is becoming, I think, is one thing that is a little bit of a concern. I mentioned, and I realize that in some of this I'm going to be covering similar material. I'll repeat a little bit of what I repeated last time as part of the introduction. I just think it's important, especially as I look out amongst us, and we have a lot of kids, and I know the things that they're going to come in contact with as they get older. And I imagine at the rate it's going, if the Lord doesn't come back, that by the time some of you are in your 20s and you're out in the workforce and doing stuff, this will probably be even more prevalent by then because it is growing quickly. I just want us as Christians to see and be aware of the enemy that is taking root, right? And we want to make sure that we are serving the Lord. We want to make sure that our message doesn't change. And honestly, we want to make sure that this stuff doesn't creep into our own life. I talked last time about some of the things that have gotten me thinking more and more about this. Several months ago, and I'll go into a little bit more detail than I did last time. Several months ago, I was listening to a radio program on NPR. For some of you, you don't know what NPR is. Others of you do and crinkle your nose. I actually listen to NPR quite a bit. I bounce back and forth between 97.1, which is a conservative talk radio program, and National Public Radio, which tends to be very left-leaning. I listen to both. It's never a good idea, in my opinion, especially when it comes to political stuff and other things like that, to simply just listen to the things that you already believe and are going to just bolster what you already believe about politics or whatever, right? So I do listen to both because if I'm going to stand against something that this other person is saying, I need to know where this person is coming from. That's just my own personal stance. But on this NPR program, they were talking, it was a series dealing with spirituality and things of the spiritual nature. And the particular one that I listened to was a lady who had turned to Wicca, which is, it's witchcraft is what it is. And this is, listen, this is somebody well-educated, very professional person. She actually talked about that where she grew up, that you were stupid if you believed in spiritual things, especially Christianity. In other words, she was raised in an area where atheism was the thing of the day, right? And if you weren't an atheist, you were just dumb. And so she said she got into adulthood with that attitude, but she had a desire for something spiritual. And as she got older, that desire for something spiritual was always there. And so she wanted to explore something. But she really wasn't interested in Christianity. And so she decided to start to look into witchcraft. I mean, again, we're talking about a well-educated, professional career person. And so she did some searching, and she found 8, I think it was 8, stores within so much distance of her apartment that sold witchcraft stuff. And so she went to one of these stores, and she was looking around. She got to talking to the guy, and she was explaining that she was just starting and just getting into it. And so he basically gave her some material, a book, and kind of directed her on what she needed to buy. And turns out that it was about the time for some, I don't remember what it was, but it was some festival to some moon goddess. And so she decided that's where she was going to start. She went back to her apartment. She got all the stuff. She built an altar in her apartment and started worshiping this moon goddess. And she said it was really dull for a little while, but after a while, the chanting and the mantra, something changed, and she felt somebody's presence. And that was her introduction on her path to witchcraft. And this was her saying, she's now full-blown into it. This is her religion. But that's how it started for her. A need for something spiritual, wanting it to be something that was nature-based, wanting it to be something that was, getting in touch with nature. It's interesting, the more I've read about this, what's happened is as you think about the way culture has shifted and you think about what we hear today, save the planet, Mother Nature, save the trees, the animals becoming of a stature that's, almost human. There's just so many aspects, right? People want to save the world. Well, harmony and nature and all that fun stuff, right? Well, what they've done is paganism, whether it's Wicca and witchcraft or other things, basically what they've done is they've done a good job of marketing themselves as being the religion that is in touch with nature. Well, think about it. Worshipping the sun, worshipping the moon, believing that there is a force in this world that you can tap into. The idea, even in witchcraft, there's a whole lot of stuff when you look at witchcraft that deals with this world. I'm not sure how to say it, but it's a lot about using the powers of this world. Crystals. We were in a store the other day and they had a bunch of amethyst crystals, and there was a sign dealing with how amethysts are supposed to protect from blah, 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 blah. Right? And so again, even in witchcraft, there's a lot of stuff that deals with taking the things of this world and tapping into their powers, wearing things around your neck that are supposed to protect from X, Y, and Z. Right? So there's a lot of that stuff. So if you think about a generation that's been coming up, and they've heard about climate change, and they've heard about save the planet, and they've heard about all these things about nature and how we need to tap into nature and love nature more, well, along comes paganism and witchcraft and other things like that. And what they've done is they've done a good job of marketing themselves as a spiritual path that taps into Mother Nature, that taps into things like that. And this professional lady, right, she now considers herself a witch. That's no other way to say it. She regularly sets up altars in her apartment and worships various moon goddesses. So I heard that and I thought, what in the world? This is not like a late night, in the middle of the night when nobody is awake news program. This is a middle of the day, prime time newscast, editorial, whatever you want to call it, right? And it's just common. It's normal. For a lot of people, it doesn't even raise eyebrows anymore. It's like, oh yeah, okay, so you're a Wicca. Big deal. If you remember some of the articles that I mentioned last time, CNN, CBS, New York Times, these are all articles, these are all publications that in the last few years have had very pro-paganism articles. I think I mentioned last time, and I'll say this and then we'll move on to some other things. I think I mentioned last time 2 different articles that dealt with the idea that a belief that's starting to come to being is that we are in the time period of the death of Christianity. And that it's not that Christianity was going to go away completely, but these people believe that the culture of the world is on the verge of change. And that for the last couple thousand years, we have been controlled and dominated and shaped by Judaism and Christianity. That politics, the Western culture, the foundations of what we believe, what our morals are based on, what our ethics are based on, is all coming from a root and a grounding in Christianity. And that what these philosophers now believe is that we are seeing the death of that, and that what we're seeing is and this is the way they'll market it, the rebirth of paganism. And that in future years, ethics, morality, governments, and things like that will have their foundation in paganism, not in Christianity. And that's what they mean by that we're living in the age of the death of Christianity. That now paganism will be the foundation for all of those things. In their words, as it once was. Right? That's the other piece of the marketing that they're using with witchcraft and other things is, and listen, grain of truth. They will market Wicca and paganism and these other New Age stuff as pre-Christianity, that they have their roots in pre-Christian teachings. Well, they can say that because in their mind, Christianity started in the 1st century. You know, I realized as I was studying some of this, I understand, when I say grain of truth, I understand that Christ came and there was new revelation, and yes, it changed the dynamic, and people were first called Christians at that time. But you know, for me, my beliefs and what I believe didn't start in the 1st century. It started in Genesis chapter 1. When God created the world, man fell, and God gave his first prophecy about what was to come, right? The God that I serve, the God that I worship, is pre-paganism. But what you'll hear it marketed as is paganism is pre-Christianity. Our religion is older than your religion, is what they're saying. And they'll actually talk about, it is interesting to me, because for years I've heard about, especially in Catholicism, how that there's different things they do and practice that have pagan roots. And in some degree, like, there's a small percentage of people that will say that openly and talk about that. And most people look at them like they're nuts. Did you know that pagans actually say that? Pagans say that. They will say, well, paganism never really went away. Paganism was buried inside the church. And there were pieces of it that have been there from the beginning. And it's now being reborn. As what? As people get tired of Christianity, as people see the hypocrisy of Christianity, as this happens, they still want something, and I'm paraphrasing from articles I've read, they still want something, they just don't want Christianity, and this stuff has a spiritual aspect to it. There's even some of it that may be slightly related to what they may have done as a child, and it's comfortable. These are some of the, and I'm using the term marketing, right? These are some of the things that they have done really well at marketing, right? Tapping into nature, pre-Christian, and by the way, it can fulfill that spiritual need you have with still some similarities to maybe what you did as a child. Man, they've done a good job of marketing it to several generations now that have been coming up and are calloused toward Christianity, maybe they have seen some things that Christians have done that shouldn't have done, and they're turning away from that. And the open arms of paganism is ready, willing, and able to accept them. We talked a little bit about how prominent it is, really. Star Wars. Star Wars is New Age religion. It talks about tapping into the Force, and there's the good Force and the bad Force. I hate to say it, guys, but that really, it preaches New Age religion. That's what that is. I don't even know why it's called New Age, but it really is that idea. Marvel. Man, I've watched all those movies. I love those movies. They're entertaining. But what I try to remind people of, we look at Marvel and we watch a movie like Thor. Hey, Thor's the hero. He's the good guy. Did you know that there was a time when people like the Vikings actually worshipped Odin and Thor and Loki? Those are not new names. Those are actually Norse mythological gods. People worshipped them and thought they were real. Do you know there's been an increase in the amount of Thor worship in the last X number of years? You think I'm funny, but I'm not kidding. I talked last time a little bit about a family member of mine who had posted that they went to a winter solstice festival. And if you understand what a winter solstice festival is, if you look at paganism, pagans actually do have a winter solstice festival. And this festival that they went to, right, they burn a Yule log, they have a big feast, they have these little stones with markings on them that they cast out, and these stones are going to predict for you how your next year is going to be. And now I get it. Some people go to that because it's entertaining. But listen, there are people that go to that because they believe it. There are people that go to that because that is the path that they have taken. It's not just entertainment. For some people it is. I get that. But listen, there are people that truly believe that stuff. I read, I'm going to read to you pieces of this, and please understand, this is not my intention. I'm not one of those guys. This is a book about the stories behind the traditions of Christmas. I'm not here to pick on Christmas. That is not my intent. But this is a book that I have. This is actually a guy by the name of Ace Collins. He's written a lot of books. He is a religious man. This is actually a very pro-Christmas book. I use this book as an example simply because he has a section in here about the Yule log. And I was thinking about this and got this book out because I remembered it was in here. I was thinking about this because of that Winter Solstice Festival. As you look it up, one of the primary things about a Winter Solstice Festival is the burning of the Yule log. And if you study the history of the burning of the Yule log, it has a lot of very ancient aspects to it. I think we sometimes have to be careful. There are some things that we do today that probably have some pagan backgrounds, and I've kind of been in the stance that, you know what, a couple thousand years ago or 1,000 years ago they were. Nobody thinks of it like that anymore. Like, we can move on. But I think what's a little bit scary is that as time marches on and paganism starts to be reborn, so to speak, listen, there are people that believe in the Yule log the way the Yule log used to be practiced. And that's a little scary. This guy has no issue with the Yule log, but I think it's interesting when you read some of what he says. Again, this is the name of this book, to give it credit, is Stories Behind the Great Traditions of Christmas by Ace Collins. It says the Yule log. The word Yule was first used to describe an ancient Viking ritual that celebrated the winter solstice. Yule was derived from the Norse word jule, which means wheel. It was probably chosen to describe the ritual because many Norse people viewed their calendar as a wheel slowly turning through the seasons. Living in regions where oppressive darkness ruled much of the winter, these Nordic people naturally celebrated mightily when the shortest day of the year ended on December 20th. The passing of this date led to longer days, more light and warmth, and the promise of summer. As part of the solstice celebration, the Vikings would cut a huge log, drag it back to the village, set it afire, and the Yule log was supposed to drive away evil spirits, bring good luck to people of the area, and welcome the sun back to the skies. In the process of doing all these things, the fire probably took a bit of the chill out of the cold air too, though the burning of the log during the winter solstice is now almost always associated with the ancient people of Scandinavia. They probably borrowed the custom from earlier civilizations. So what he's saying is that some of our earliest recordings of it, and really where the name Yule comes from, is the Vikings celebrating the winter solstice. Okay? But he also says if you go back further, you can find similar traditions in other cultures. It wouldn't have been called the Yule log, but it'd be similar. Cleopatra was surely familiar with the custom of a log burning during what is now known as December, as Moses probably was. The Egyptians had a custom of burning logs for the celebration of their winter solstice during the lives of these two historical icons, dating back to 5000 BC. In Egypt, the flames of these fires honored the sun god Horus. The Sumerians burned similar logs during the final days of the winter, as did most of the smaller groups. 30 years after the death of Jesus Christ, Roman culture adopted Mithras, the Persian sun god. Starting in the 5th decade of the 1st century, the citizens of Rome burned a log during the initial 10 days of the Saturnalia festival to usher in another year of the strong rule of Mithras. Throughout history, other groups living in Europe and Asia burned large logs during the solstice as well, but it was the Vikings who put and kept the Yule log on the map. It goes on and talks about how that the Vikings, when they got to the Celtic Druids, that the Celtic Druids took up this as part of their practice for worshiping midwinter or Fiona's Day, and that trees were important to the religious beliefs of the Celtics, and that they would again burn these logs as a way of worship. They would anoint the timber with salt, holly, wine, and spices, and then light the wood with a piece of the previous year's Yule log. I'm going to summarize some of this. It was like the lady, the woman of the house, it was her job to save off a piece of the Yule log at the end of the celebration, and she would hide it like under her bed at the house, and it was up to her to restart the Yule log with last year's log this year. So at the end, she would take a sliver or a piece of that Yule log that had been burning as part of this celebration. And then next year, when they'd get the new log out, you had to start the fire with the log from the prior year, which linked back to the year before, which linked back to the year before. So it's a succession thing. It actually, the book talks about how big of a deal and how stressful this was, because you were supposed to be able to light the Yule log on your first try. And if you didn't, it meant bad luck for your family for the next year. And so like this poor woman who's responsible for lighting this log, one, she can't lose the piece, because if you lose the piece, that's really bad. But then you got to start it, and you got to start it on the first attempt. And if you don't, your family is going to have bad luck for the next year, right? Especially when you think about the fact that, hey, lighting this was supposed to keep the evil spirits away and was supposed to do all this stuff for you. It's a big deal. A poor woman. It does go in and it talks about that when some of the Catholic knights came through some of these Celtic areas, that there had already been a little bit of a tradition of burning a log in memory of Christ. And that this would have been, that basically he talks about how that this would have been an easy way for them to take the celebration of the Yule log and then tie it into Christianity and allow it to be an easier transition for these pagans to accept Christianity. They would often drag up this Yule log and they would have it early, and during the year of drying, they would rub it with spices and rum and wine, and that way when you burned it, those appealing odors would fill the area. Eventually, obviously, it moved into the inside. They used to burn it outside, then they'd take it and burn it inside. There's just a whole lot of stuff to this, and I don't have time to get into all this, but as I read some of this, what he talks about is that as it became accepted and part of the more mainstream Christian, and when I say Christian, you understand that lots of times in those time periods when people would say things like that, they were talking about the Catholic Church, that it was accepted within the Catholic Church. And it's just, as he describes it, even though it was now part of Catholicism, some of the symbols were still the same. But as he talks about how that even though supposedly they were worshiping Christ, that they still felt like it was warding off evil spirits. They still practiced the idea that good luck, bad luck, depending on how you got it started or didn't get it started. And even he talks about how that Christianity had a hard time letting go of all of the things it was supposed to do while it was being done in pagan worship. That even though it had been adapted into Christianity, even those Christians held on to the aspects of what it was meant to accomplish. And so it's just, as I read through some of this, and I'll spare you all of it, you guys are welcome to borrow the book if you want to. It just kind of walks through the history of how we got to where we are today, which half the time I think the Yule log anymore is not even a piece of wood. It talks about how that in some traditions, I think it was in France or somewhere, that eventually it turned into something you baked and you cut it up in the middle of the day. But the history of where it came from was interesting. And I think what caught my attention to it was some of these things that do have the roots in paganism, some of these things that do represent the worship of false gods, they are having a resurgence. And not in regards to, well, those things don't represent that anymore. No, I'm saying people are starting to go back and use them the way the Celtics did and the Vikings did. A lot of that, as you look at what's been popularized through TV, what's been popularized through all kinds of things, as people drift away from Christianity and they grasp something else, man, they look at the history and like, hey, the Celtics were cool. You know, the Celtics were a proud people. The Celtics accomplished so much. They did so much. And then you start to see some similarities in some things, and you can tap into those things. And people are actually starting to go back and worship some of those things that used to be worshipped and fell away. But they're coming back. And it's more and more mainstream as we move forward. I'm going to read you one other article. This is most of the articles I read to you outside of this book. Last week, all the articles I read to you were actually pro-paganism. This is actually an apologetics webpage called Apologetics Resource Center. I think the guy that wrote this was a guy by the name of Brandon Showalter. He says, the population of self-identified witches has risen dramatically in the United States in recent decades as interest in astrology and witchcraft practices have become increasingly mainstream. While data is sparse, courts noted the practice of witchcraft has grown significantly in recent decades. Those who identify as witches has risen concurrently with the rise of witch anesthetic. While the U.S. government doesn't regularly collect detailed religious data because of concerns that it may violate the separation of church and state, several organizations have tried to fill in the data gap. From 1990 to 2008, Trinity College in Connecticut ran 3 large, detailed religion surveys. Those have shown that Wicca grew tremendously over this period of time. From an estimated 8,000 Wiccans in 1990, they found that there were about 340,000 practitioners in 2008. So from 1990 to 2008, you go from publicly proclaiming themselves as Wiccans as 8,000 to 340,000 publicly proclaiming themselves as Wiccans in 2008. Pew Research Center studied the issue in 2014 and discovered that about 0.4% of Americans, approximately 1 million to 1.5 million, now identify as pagan or Wicca, meaning their communities continue to experience significant growth. The rapid rise is not a surprise to some, given philosophical and spiritual trends in the culture. It makes sense that witchcraft and the occult would rise as society becomes increasingly postmodern. The rejection of Christianity has left a void that people, as inherently spiritual beings, will seek to fill. This was stated by Julie Rose, who was from the Moody Radio. Plus, Wicca has effectively repackaged witchcraft for millennial consumption. No longer is witchcraft and paganism satanic. She said it is deemed pre-Christian tradition that promotes free thought and understanding of earth and nature. So, listen, back in like the early, mid 80s and stuff, you'd hear stuff about, Satanism and the Church of Satan and all that stuff, and it was painted in a very dark light. That's not the way it's talked about anymore. It's not deemed demonic and satanic. It reminds me of a verse that talks about an angel of light, right? No, hey, Wicca, man, it's not demonic, it's not satanic, it promotes free thought, it promotes love of nature, it promotes tapping into the universe. Man, they're taking an ugly pig and putting lipstick on it, so this saying goes, right? This article continues to talk about some things, as well as mentioning, and this is one thing that jumped out at me, as mainline Protestantism continues its de-evolution, the U.S. witch population is rising astronomically. There may now be, and it says maybe, there may now be more Americans who identify as practicing witches, 1.5 million, than there are members of mainline Presbyterianism, which is 1.4 million. Think about that. There's mainline Presbyterianism, and I realize there's several branches of it. Mainline Presbyterianism, there's an estimated 1.4 million members of that church. There's 1.5 million estimated people that define themselves as Wiccan or some other form of paganism. You might say, well, you really didn't need to take up 2 lessons to talk about this. But I'm telling you, and I want to stress to you, Satan is influencing this world more and more and more. More and more people they haven't just rejected Christianity and turned to atheism. They're rejecting Christianity and turning to paganism. Whether that's worshiping the trees, the sun, the moon, the stars, whether that's worshiping some Norse god named Thor, they are worshiping something other than the true God. And it is taking root and it is spreading very quickly. I imagine that 10, 15, 20 years from now, like I said, if the Lord doesn't come back, I can only imagine how mainstream some of this stuff is going to be. And when I got done with the lesson last week, and we got in our car and Tanya was driving home, I pulled out my phone and I did a search and I said, witchcraft supplies near me. You want to know how many stores that came up in St. Charles that defined themselves as metaphysical supply stores? Fancy word, by the way, metaphysical. There's 5 in St. Charles that I found that define themselves as metaphysical supply stores. And when you look at the things they sell, charms, enchantments, witchcraft books, crystals that you can hang around your neck to ward off evil spirits. 5 of them in St. Charles. Now, I understand a lot of people may go to those stores that aren't practicing witchcraft, but they think it's funny or they think it's cute or maybe they buy into some piece of it. But you think about how mainstream it's becoming when St. Charles can support 5 stores. Last week I read, and we'll read these 2 passages and close. Deuteronomy chapter 18. This is some of the message that the Lord gave to Moses to share with the children of Israel as they were preparing to go into the promised land. In Deuteronomy 18, verse 9, it says, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that uses divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God. For these nations which thou shalt possess hearken unto observers of times and diviners. But as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee so to do." The Bible says that people that practice, and not just the people that practice, but those things, witches, wizards, charmers, necromancers, familiar spirits, observers of times, divinations, those things are an abomination unto the Lord. Abomination is a strong word, guys. The Lord hates those things. Matter of fact, the Lord told the nation of Israel that part of why the people in that land were being driven out and were going to be destroyed was because of their practice of those things. For these nations which thou shalt possess hearkened unto observers of times and unto diviners. But as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee to do so. He said, I have zero tolerance for this when it comes to you. Zero. I also want you to read, if you would, in Acts chapter 19. Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 17, says, "And this was known to all the Jews and Greeks also dwelling at Ephesus, and fear fell on them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was magnified. And many that believed came and confessed and showed their deeds. Many of them also which used curious arts brought their books together and burned them before all men. And they counted the price of them and found it to be 50,000 pieces of silver. So mightily grew the word of God." What you see here is a group of people who, in a pagan land that used enchantments. When it talks about curious arts, that's what that's dealing with. It's talking about enchantments and witchcraft and some of those other things. When the Lord saved them, they literally gathered that stuff up that they owned and they burned it. They burned it. They wanted nothing to do with it anymore. They burned it. I worry sometimes. I look at the nation of Israel, and when you study the history of the nation of Israel, and I'm going to say it this way, sometimes when you read between the lines, what it seems like is that they didn't always just jump right into idolatry and witchcraft. They still went to temple, and they did sacrifices, and they burned incense, and they did those things of God, but the influence crept in more and more and more and more, until a generation finally started to shift that way. We often read it and we think, well, they were going along one day and something caught their attention, and man, they just boom off into idol worship. That's not the way it usually went. It usually went that the people they were supposed to chase out and didn't started to influence them. And that influence became stronger. And eventually they were doing both. They were worshiping God and maybe pulling some of this into it too. God talks about how he come to hate their sacrifices. At times he even talks about how that they were still doing it, but he knew in their heart they really weren't worshiping him anymore. I've asked myself a few times, and if I'm honest with myself, I'm maybe a little too scared to actually follow through with this. Maybe that's the wrong way of saying it. I have thought about these people in Ephesus that gathered up all their stuff of witchcraft, and they gathered it together and they burned it. And it talks about how much that was worth when those people did that. I've often thought, if I went through my house and I found anything in my house that was tied to witches and wizards and Roman, Greek, Norse gods and all this other stuff, how big would the pile be? I would like to sit here and say that it would be nothing or really small. I think the pile would be bigger than we think it would be. And then I start to ask myself, well, that's entertainment, or it's not a big deal. I know it's not real. But man, this is stuff God said that he hated. This is stuff that's an abomination to him. Wonder what God would think. I don't have to wonder what God would think. God sees all this stuff. He already knows it. He knows the stuff that's in my house more than I do. You know, and listen, I'm not up here trying to say what we should or shouldn't do. I am being open and transparent in the stuff that I've been thinking about and struggling with. I'm a big fan of the Marvel movies. I really do. And I've let my kids buy posters and put up posters on their wall. And as I sit here and preach about the rise of paganism and idol worship and the worship of the Greek and the Norse gods and the stuff that's really starting to regrow, it has made me think, what does the God that I serve, the true and living God, the only true God, think about a picture of a Norse god holding his hammer that controls the lightning? What does he think about that hanging on a wall in my house? I get it, it's entertainment. I get it. I know Thor's not real. And I'm not worshiping that poster. But I literally have a poster in my house of somebody that some people believe is a real God who can control lightning. You know, God talks about in Job and in other places that he's the one that controls lightning. That it's stored in his storehouses. Again, in full transparency, I don't want to go too far and be crazy. But you know, I have thought about, should I collect that stuff up and should we get it out of our house? And then I think, man, but those movies are so fun. They're entertaining. You know what I've been talking to myself about lately? Doing the right thing is not always easy. You might say, well, I'm halfway through the Loki series on Disney Plus, and it's super entertaining. I really want to know how it ends. If I really felt that that was offensive to God, am I seriously not willing to bypass my entertainment and my curiosity? If I really think that that's offensive to God? Say, well, I don't think it's offensive to God. I think we all have to come to that place and make our decision on that. But what I'm telling you is that if you start to struggle with it, you start to wonder, you start to think, how happy would God be that I've got all of this stuff in my house? It isn't going to be easy to say, well, I'm just going to get rid of all that stuff. But you know what? Serving God, it's not always easy. Sometimes we have to make decisions that we sometimes have a pulling of ourselves, an old man that says, no, I'll keep that. It's not harmful. I don't know, guys. I really don't know what the right answer is. But I will say this. Let me back up. And I know we're past time, guys, but I've always struggled with this whole thing about, you know, well, it's in TV and it's popular. Harry Potter popularized it and he makes the witchcraft and other things look good, you know, so therefore avoid it. Other people say, hey, I'm a Christian, that stuff doesn't bother me, you know, I can watch it, I recognize the entertainment factor. And I've always struggled with that whole thing. And, you know, where are you just being nitpicky and things like that? But as I've studied this, as I heard that radio newscast, and I've since started looking at some of this stuff, I do want you to think about what has been some of the most popular things on TV and in books and other things since the 1970s till now, which matches, by the way, the growth of those religions in the U.S. There's a lot of overlap. A whole lot of overlap. Listen, Marvel movies are still in my cabinet. This is something I'm still struggling with and debating with and trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. But it is alarming to me that that type of stuff is resurfacing and becoming popular and becoming accepted and becoming mainstream. And it is a stumbling block to people. And I think we need to be careful. We need to be careful what we have slowly let into our lives and become the norm. We just need to be careful. And hey, this is streaming on Facebook, this is streaming on YouTube, and I've stood up here and I've confessed some things to you guys about stuff that's in my house. I've just been open and transparent that these are things that have been going through my mind as I've studied where we're at in the U.S. with paganism and witchcraft. And I don't know that I've came to a complete answer yet. But I've been having trouble getting away from Deuteronomy that says those things about necromancers and wizards and enchantments and divers, all that stuff, that stuff is an abomination to God. And I'll tell you what, if it's an abomination to God, we need to step back and take a serious look at our life and what we let in. We need to be careful. All right. I know it's late, but I'm going to go ahead and have Brother Philip come and lead us in a song.